When airport staff kicked Barron Trump to the curb, they never expected the storm that would follow, until his father, Donald Trump, walked in and turned their world upside down. Boston International Airport was alive with movement. The soft hum of bustling activity filled the air, the kind of energy that made it easy to lose oneself among the crowd. Barron Trump stood a little apart from the others, his tall, broad frame cutting through the sea of people like a figure caught between two worlds. His face, usually stoic and reserved, betrayed a flicker of discomfort as he glanced around, trying to blend in while knowing all too well that he never could. The crowd swirled around him, rushing travelers, dragging rolling suitcases, families huddled together, children tugging at their parents' hands, their squeals of excitement echoing through the terminal. Barron's eyes briefly caught the reflection of himself in the shiny floor tiles, tall, composed, but undeniably out of place. Despite being 17, his presence felt weightier, a reminder of the father who had made headlines for decades. Being Donald Trump's son meant being noticed even in the most mundane places. He sighed inwardly, wishing for anonymity, wishing he could blend into the sea of strangers just for a moment, free from the whispers that followed him wherever he went. The terminal itself seemed to hum with life, bright lights flickering overhead, their reflections shimmering off polished floors. The smell of fresh coffee from a nearby Starbucks mixed with the oily scent of fast food from a McDonald's stand. The faint smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, masking the natural aroma of a public space where thousands of people pass through each day. Overhead, the crackling voice of an announcer echoed through the PA system, calling out flight numbers in a hurried cadence, quickly drowned out by snippets of conversations and the rhythmic beeping of electric carts zipping past. The sounds blurred together, forming a constant, mindless background noise. To anyone else, the chaos of the airport was just part of the experience. To Barron, it was a familiar dissonance that felt like a soundtrack to his life, never truly his own. But today was different. Today, as he stood in line at the gate for his flight, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He had been here countless times before, yet this was different. Maybe it was the newness of the place, the anonymity of a Boston airport compared to the usual high-profile airports where his father's presence loomed larger than life. Or maybe it was just the sense of something shifting in the air around him. Something was coming, and he had no way of knowing how it would unfold. Barron tried to ignore the small knot in his stomach, but it lingered. The reality of living in the public eye, even when you were only a passenger at an airport, was something he had never truly gotten used to. At 17, most kids were figuring out who they were, but Barron had long since accepted that his identity was shaped by forces beyond his control. The son of Donald Trump, the president, the businessman, the force of nature who dominated headlines could never escape that shadow. No matter how many times he wished for a quiet life, for the chance to be simply Barron, he was forever caught between the expectations of the world and his own desire for peace. His hand rested in his pocket, fingers brushing against the crumpled first-class ticket that was supposed to offer him some small comfort. A small, insignificant piece of paper that marked the difference between his reality and the one most people experience. A ticket to luxury, to comfort, to a life that was distinctly not his own. Yet despite the privileges that came with his name, Barron had always been aware of the fine line between privilege and isolation. As he approached the gate, the voice of the gate agent cut through the hum of the terminal, pulling him back to the present. The agent, a middle-aged man with sharp, calculating eyes, peered at Barron over his glasses. His gaze lingered just a moment too long, assessing Barron in a way that felt colder than most. "Young man," the agent began, his voice firm, "are you sure this is your boarding group?" Barron's eyebrow twitched, a flicker of frustration igniting behind his calm demeanor. "Yes, I have a first-class ticket," he replied, keeping his voice steady and polite. He held out his ticket, a subtle sign of assurance, but the agent's eyes narrowed further. The man didn't take the ticket immediately. Instead, he scrutinized it as though Barron were some sort of anomaly, his furrowed brow deepening with each passing second. Barron fought the urge to ask what the problem was, to demand an explanation. Instead, he stood there still, his expression impassive, trying to hold on to the calm exterior that had become second nature to him. But it didn't stop there. The agent's gaze flicked up from the ticket, briefly scanning Barron's face with a mixture of suspicion and superiority. The faintest of smirks tugged at the corners of his lips, a look that seemed to question Barron's right to be there at all. Then, without looking up, the agent waved his hand dismissively. "Please step aside. I'll need to verify your identity," he said, a hint of condescension in his tone. Barron's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He had dealt with this before. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned him because of his last name. His father's legacy seemed to cast a long, unforgiving shadow, and Barron had learned that the world often made assumptions about who he was, even before he could open his mouth. But it was different when it happened in public, in front of strangers, where he was exposed, vulnerable. The stares of the people in line, the murmurs that spread like wildfire. He could feel them now, prickling against his skin, though he kept his face expressionless. He took a slow, measured step to the side, his thoughts racing. Was it because of his name? Was it because of who he was? Or was it just the agent's own prejudice? He didn't know. All he knew was that something was off. Something about the way the man looked at him felt wrong. It wasn't just about the ticket. It was about the way Barron was being treated, like an outsider, like he didn't belong. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tension palpable. Someone in line pulled out their phone. Another quietly whispered to their companion. Barron's face flushed a deep shade of red, but he kept his head high, refusing to let the embarrassment show. As the minutes ticked by, his frustration built, each second feeling longer than the last. The gate agent's voice broke through his thoughts. "I'll need to call a supervisor. This just doesn't seem right." The gate agent's words hung in the air as Barron stood motionless, fighting the urge to speak up, to defend himself. He wanted to ask why he was being treated like this, but he knew it wouldn't help. It never did. Instead, he bit his lip, suppressing the emotions that threatened to bubble up. The minutes dragged on as the agent made a call, his voice low and curt as he explained the situation to a supervisor. Barron could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, their silent judgment a constant presence. He didn't need to look up to know that they were watching, whispering. Some were curious, some were amused, others just indifferent. A few took out their phones, eager to capture the moment, to share whatever drama was unfolding. Barron could already hear the first murmurs from the crowd. "What's going on? Why is he being treated like this?" A voice from behind him, a mother holding her young child, whispered, "He's just a kid, right? Why is he being singled out?" But Barron didn't need anyone's pity. He didn't need them to validate what he knew in his gut, that this was about who he was, not what he was doing. He was Barron Trump, and that was enough for some people to look at him like a problem to be solved. When the supervisor arrived, it was clear that things were about to escalate further. The supervisor was a middle-aged man with a stiff posture, wearing a navy blue suit that looked a size too big for him. He approached with a sense of urgency, but there was a condescending edge to his movement, as if Barron was a puzzle he needed to solve, not a person to be respected. His eyes swept over Barron, scanning him quickly, as though he was trying to find something, anything, to make the situation more manageable. "Is there a problem here?" The supervisor's voice was sharp, almost dismissive. The gate agent wasted no time explaining the situation, his words clipped and mechanical. "This young man's ticket doesn't seem to match the boarding group. I need to verify his identity." He handed the ticket to the supervisor, but the supervisor barely looked at it before shoving it aside and gesturing to Barron. "Step over here. We'll need to check your ID," the supervisor said, his voice heavy with impatience. Barron's stomach churned. The last thing he wanted was to be paraded around like some kind of criminal. But he couldn't ignore the crowd anymore. Their eyes were on him, some sympathetic, others judging, and a few intrigued by the spectacle. He glanced around, meeting the eyes of a few passengers. The businessman who had been muttering earlier now stood with his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with an expression that bordered on amusement. Another passenger, a young woman, had her phone out, her fingers flying over the screen as she tweeted. Barron could only guess what she was writing, but he knew it wouldn't be flattering. As the supervisor began asking more questions, Barron's patience started to thin. He didn't want to be rude, but he couldn't understand why this was happening. It wasn't as though he didn't have a valid ticket. It wasn't as though he was acting out of line. He was just a teenager, trying to get to his destination like everyone else. But to these people, it seemed his name was enough to make him a target. "I told you, I have a first-class ticket. I'm not sure what the problem is," Barron said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. He wanted to make it clear that he wasn't backing down. The supervisor's eyes narrowed, and he gestured to one of the officers standing nearby. "Take him aside," he ordered. "We'll sort this out in private." Barron wanted to argue, to demand that they stop making a spectacle of him, but something inside him told him it wouldn't do any good. Instead, he nodded curtly and allowed himself to be led away, his steps heavy as he moved toward the small, sterile area near the back of the gate. The sound of the crowd's murmurs followed him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Once inside the small holding room, the door clicked shut behind him, and the quiet seemed suffocating. The air smelled of stale coffee and cleaning products, a sharp contrast to the fresh air of the terminal. A single overhead light flickered above, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the space. It felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. The officer and supervisor exchanged words, but Barron barely heard them. His mind was racing, his pulse quickening. He could feel the weight of the situation settling on him like a heavy coat. Why was this happening? Why him? "Sit," one of the officers said, his tone flat. Barron didn't argue. He sat down at the metal table, feeling the coldness of it seep through his jeans. His fingers drummed nervously on the surface as he tried to keep his emotions in check. He didn't want to lose his cool, didn't want to give anyone a reason to think he was anything less than composed. But underneath the calm exterior, there was anger, an anger that was bubbling up, threatening to surface. He hated being treated like this. He hated that his name meant more than who he was. He hated that it was always about expectations, assumptions, and judgments. "We just need to verify your ID," one of the officers said, his voice distant, almost robotic. "Then we'll let you go." Barron nodded, though inside he was screaming. He wanted to stand up, to yell, to demand an explanation, but the words stuck in his throat, and he remained silent. Outside, the murmurs of the crowd continued. The cameras flashed, and Barron, trapped in this moment, could only wonder how long it would be before someone, his father perhaps, came to his rescue. The minutes dragged on in the holding room, each one feeling like an eternity. Barron's fingers continued to tap anxiously on the table, the cold metallic surface under his hands offering no comfort. The fluorescent lights above hummed quietly, almost mocking his frustration. His mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened, what was still happening. He had been pulled aside like a criminal, his every action scrutinized by people who didn't care to understand. Was it really about the ticket, or was it because of who he was? Was he just another target, another name that people assumed was guilty of something? Barron closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to stay calm. He had learned to be composed, to keep his emotions under wraps. It was part of the life he had inherited, part of being the son of Donald Trump. But today it felt different. The weight of the situation, the crowd watching from the gate, the silence of the holding room, all of it felt suffocating. In the back seat of a black SUV weaving through Boston traffic, Donald Trump sat, his phone in hand. He had planned a quick trip to surprise his son at the airport after his flight, but as his phone buzzed with a flood of text messages and social media alerts, his expression shifted from calm to concern. One message caught his attention. "Something's going on with Barron at the airport. People are posting videos." His fingers flew across the screen, pulling up a short clip that showed Barron surrounded by security, being led away from the gate. He replayed it twice, his scowl deepening with each pass. "Let's go," he barked to the driver, his voice sharp, commanding. "Step on it! We need to get there faster. This is a disgrace." Meanwhile, back at the airport, Barron sat in the small room, staring at the blank wall in front of him. The officers had stepped out to verify his credentials, leaving him alone to stew in silence. He didn't know who to call or what to do. The door to the room creaked open, and Barron looked up to see two security officers step inside. They were imposing figures, both tall and broad, their uniforms crisp and professional. But there was something cold about their presence, something distant. They didn't look at Barron with sympathy or understanding. They just looked at him as if he were an inconvenience to be dealt with. One of the officers cleared his throat, his voice low and formal. "We're here to verify your ID, sir." Barron nodded, though the motion felt mechanical, almost as if he was going through the motions just to get it over with. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID, handing it over to the officer without a word. The officer took it without hesitation, scanning it quickly, then handing it to his partner. The second officer examined it carefully, but there was no acknowledgement of Barron beyond the cold, clinical gaze they both wore. They were just doing their job, and Barron wasn't a person to them, just a problem to be solved. The room felt smaller with every passing second, the tension rising like a thick fog. Barron's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He wanted to lash out, to demand to know why he was being treated this way. But he held back, keeping his frustration buried beneath a veneer of calm. The officers exchanged a few words, their voices low but firm. Barron couldn't catch everything, but the occasional words that drifted to him made it clear that this was nothing more than a formality. A formality that, in his case, felt like a punishment. "We'll be done shortly," one of the officers said, his tone flat. "Please remain seated." Barron said nothing, just nodded stiffly. His gaze shifted to the window, where he could see the bustle of the terminal beyond. Passengers moved about, oblivious to his plight, absorbed in their own lives. In that moment, Barron felt completely alone. No one knew what he was going through, not the passengers, not the officers, and certainly not the gate agent who had set this whole thing in motion. The minutes passed in oppressive silence. Every so often, Barron would glance toward the door, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might offer a glimpse of hope. He knew his father had to be on his way. There was no way Donald Trump wouldn't intervene in a situation like this. His father wouldn't let this go. And yet the wait felt endless. Each second that ticked by seemed like a reminder of how powerless he was in this moment. The longer he sat there, the more it seemed like this wasn't just about the ticket. It was about something bigger. It was about his last name. It was about the expectations that came with being Donald Trump's son. It was about assumptions and stereotypes, and no amount of politeness or composure would change that. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the door to the holding room opened again. But this time, it wasn't another officer who stepped through. It was someone far more familiar. Barron's eyes widened as his father strode into the room, his presence immediately filling the space. Donald Trump, tall and imposing, moved with purpose, his suit sharp and perfectly pressed. The sight of him, the unmistakable authority in his step, was enough to make Barron exhale in a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Barron stood as his father approached, but Donald waved him back down. He was focused, his gaze locked on the officers and the supervisor who had just walked in behind him. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of Donald's presence. His power was palpable, a force that made even the most hardened individuals straighten up and take notice. "What's going on here?" Donald's voice was loud, direct, cutting through the tension in the room like a hot knife through butter. The officers and the supervisor exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly intimidated by the man standing before them. They fumbled with their words, unsure of how to explain what had led to this moment. Barron watched in silence, a mix of emotions flooding him. There was relief, of course. His father was here, and he knew Donald wouldn't let anything happen to him. But there was also something else, a sense of discomfort at the way his father was taking control. He didn't need Donald to fight his battles, not like this. But he couldn't deny that in this moment, his father's presence was a kind of armor, a shield against the injustices he was facing. Donald turned to the supervisor, his eyes hard and calculating. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice low but dripping with authority. "You have my son locked in this room like a criminal. For what? A mistake with his boarding group?" The supervisor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stammered, visibly rattled by Donald's interrogation. "I'm not interested in your excuses," Donald continued, his voice unwavering. "I want answers. Now." Barron's heart thudded in his chest. He hadn't heard his father speak like this in a long time. So sure, so forceful. It was like watching a lion defend its cub. The supervisor swallowed hard, clearly realizing he had no choice but to comply. Sir, there was confusion about his ticket. We were just... Donald cut him off with a wave of his hand. Enough. I don't care about your protocols. I care about what's right. And what's right is treating my son with respect. Barron's emotions swirled, a mixture of gratitude and unease. His father was taking control, but at what cost? What would happen next? The room was silent except for the muffled hum of the fluorescent lights above. Barron sat back down, his thoughts whirling as he watched his father, larger than life, dominate the space. Donald's commanding presence was undeniable. The supervisor and the security officers appeared to shrink in the face of it. Even though Donald's expression was stern, there was an unmistakable sense of control in his every movement. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and in this moment it was clear that he would not let the situation slide. The supervisor cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he spoke. Sir, we're just following procedure. The young man's ticket... Procedure? Donald interrupted, stepping closer to the supervisor, his gaze never leaving the man's face. I don't give a damn about your procedure. This is my son, and you've humiliated him in front of a crowd. Now, I want you to make this right. Immediately. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, clearly overwhelmed by the force of Donald's words. He glanced at the officers who were standing off to the side, looking more like spectators than participants in the confrontation. They didn't seem to know what to do. Donald's presence had rendered them speechless, and Barron could feel the shift in the room. It was no longer a holding room, it had become an arena, and his father was the undisputed champion. Barron shifted in his seat, his emotions a mix of relief and something else, something he couldn't quite place. He had always admired his father's confidence, his ability to handle situations with ease. But in moments like this, when his father was so assertive, so relentless, Barron sometimes felt like an afterthought. The spotlight was always on Donald, never on him. Donald turned back to Barron, his gaze softening for just a moment. Barron, you're better than this, he said quietly, though still loud enough for the supervisor to hear. You don't need to let anyone treat you like this. Not now, not ever. Barron's chest tightened at the words. His father was right. He was better than this. He didn't need to let these strangers dictate how he felt. He had spent too many years trying to shrink into the background, trying to avoid the public eye. But no one had the right to treat him like this, not because of who he was, not because of his last name. Donald turned back to the supervisor. You have two options. Apologize publicly, here, in front of everyone, or I'll make sure this gets out to the press. You think you can handle that? The supervisor swallowed hard, the weight of Donald's words sinking in. He glanced around the room at the officers, who, despite their uniforms and training, were clearly out of their depth in the face of Donald's forceful presence. Finally, after a long, tense pause, the supervisor nodded, albeit reluctantly. We'll issue an apology, sir. Barron could feel the air shift. There was no mistaking it. The supervisor had folded. It was over, at least for now. But that didn't mean the ordeal was finished. Barron knew that something bigger was at play, something beyond his personal embarrassment. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up against something larger, something ingrained in society. And his father, for all his flaws, was right here, helping him fight it. Donald turned to the crowd that had gathered around the gate. The passengers who had been recording the incident now stood still, watching the drama unfold with bated breath. Donald's gaze swept over them, his voice rising as he addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his tone strong, commanding. This isn't just about my son. This is about fairness. This is about dignity. No one, no matter their background, no matter their name, should be treated like this. We're better than this, and we need to do better. The crowd shifted, and Barron could feel a surge of support, a quiet applause building. Some passengers nodded in agreement, others whispered their approval. For a moment, the world outside the holding room seemed to disappear, and it was just them, the people who had witnessed the injustice, and the people who were determined to make things right. Barron stood, his body tense but steady, as he watched his father command the room. This was what strength looked like. This was what it meant to fight for what was right. As the supervisor began to speak, his voice shaky, apologizing for the misunderstanding, Barron tuned him out. The words meant little to him. It wasn't about the apology. It was about the moment, the way things had shifted, the way the balance of power had tilted in their favor. "We're sorry for the inconvenience," the supervisor continued, though it was clear his heart wasn't in the apology. "There was a mistake with the ticket and it won't happen again." Donald's gaze hardened, not satisfied with the half-heartedness of the apology. "That's not good enough," he said, his voice a little louder now, cutting through the room like a hot knife. "I want you to mean it. I want you to own it." The supervisor nodded, visibly flustered, and finally gave a more sincere apology. The crowd seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Barron could hear a few murmurs of approval, and for the first time since the incident began, he felt a little less like a target, a little more like someone who had fought back. The ordeal was far from over, but it was starting to feel like it was winding down. Barron and his father made their way to the lounge, where the weight of what had just transpired finally began to settle in. Donald led the way, his stride unyielding, as Barron followed quietly behind him. When they reached the lounge, Donald turned to Barron, his face softening as he put a hand on his son's shoulder. "You did good, kid. You stayed calm, and you didn't let them break you. That's strength." Barron looked up at his father, a mixture of gratitude and discomfort in his chest. "I just didn't want to make a scene." "I know," Donald said, his voice gentler now. "But sometimes you have to make a scene. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right. You did the right thing by staying calm, but don't ever let anyone walk over you. Not now, not ever." Barron nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He had always admired his father's strength, his unwavering confidence. But today he had learned something important, not just from his father's intervention, but from his own actions. He had stood up for himself, in his own way, and it had made a difference. After the incident, Donald wasted no time. Sitting in the back of the SUV, his phone in hand, he tapped out a tweet. "What happened to Barron today is unacceptable. Every person deserves respect, no matter their name or background. We must do better." The tweet went viral almost immediately. The public response was swift and overwhelming. Support flooded in from all corners, applauding Donald for his decisive action and his unflinching defense of his son. It wasn't just about Barron anymore. It was about the broader message of fairness and dignity. Barron sat quietly in the lounge, staring out the window as the plane finally began to taxi down the runway. The city lights of Boston grew smaller and smaller in the distance, but his mind was still heavy with everything that had unfolded. His father's presence, so commanding in the airport, still echoed in his thoughts. Donald, sitting beside him, scrolled through his phone, checking the flood of messages and reactions to his tweet. Barron could sense the weight of his father's attention to the situation. Donald's ability to shift public opinion so effortlessly had always amazed him. But this time, Barron realized, his father's influence had been more than just about power. It had been about making a stand for what was right. "What's on your mind?" Donald asked, breaking the silence as he set his phone down. His voice was softer now, less forceful, as if the storm had passed and they were both catching their breath. Barron hesitated, then spoke, his voice steady but reflective. "I don't know, Dad. I guess I just don't want to be in the spotlight all the time. But today I learned something important. It's not about me being in the spotlight. It's about standing up when something's wrong." Donald's expression softened slightly, his gaze steady. "Exactly. You don't have to be loud to make a difference. Sometimes you have to do the quiet things, the right things. But when people try to tear you down, you stand your ground. That's what I did for you today, because no one should ever treat you that way. No one." Barron nodded slowly. He had always admired his father's forceful, no-nonsense approach. But today, something had clicked. He had seen his father's strength, but he had also seen his own. In that holding room, in the middle of the chaos, he had managed to hold his head high, even when the world seemed against him. And in that moment, it had felt like a victory. They sat in silence for a while longer, the hum of the airplane engines a comforting background to the weight of the conversation. Finally, Donald picked up his phone again, his eyes scanning the screen. A new message had come through. He read it silently before looking up at Barron. "You know," Donald said with a small grin, "you've got a lot of people standing with you now. The apology wasn't just about what happened today. It's about showing the world that we won't stand for unfair treatment. That's what real change looks like." Barron thought about it for a moment. It wasn't just about the incident at the airport, or about the public apology, or even about the video that had gone viral. It was about the lessons that could be learned from something like this. The importance of standing up for yourself, of demanding respect, and of doing so with dignity. "Maybe we all need to do better," Barron said quietly, his voice full of thought. "Maybe we all need to speak up when something's wrong." Donald's gaze softened again, and he gave a small nod. "Exactly. Change starts with awareness and action, and you've already started making that difference. Today wasn't just about fighting back. It was about standing for something bigger." Barron let out a breath, feeling the weight of those words settle in. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he understood that true strength came from standing firm in your beliefs and demanding respect, no matter who you were. As the plane soared into the night sky, Barron glanced over at his father. They were different in many ways, one loud and unyielding, the other quieter, more introspective. But in that moment, they were united. They both knew the same truth. Respect and fairness weren't privileges. They were rights. And no one, no matter their name or background, should ever be denied them.